So a market segmentation analysis is something that's used incredibly much, both in academia and in industry. In industry, we use it to find groups of consumers that are similar to one another and very different from other market segments or other consumer groups. Why is that good? Because as a business or as a destination, it doesn't matter, or as a non-for-profit. I want to find the target segment that's most suitable to me, that the needs of which I can best satisfy. And then I can orient my marketing towards this target market. So in industry, everyone does it pretty much. In academia, we use it to develop knowledge, because we can learn about pockets of consumers, right? Behaving a bit differently than other pockets of consumers. In tourism research specifically, it's been incredibly heavily used. So there were 2 recent reviews. One claims that about 10% of all papers published in tourism use cluster analysis, which is one of the methods underlying market segmentation. And another paper claims, I believe, that 5% of what we do are actually straight out market segmentation studies. So it's an important method, right? And in order to derive valid insights, to draw the correct conclusions from this method, we need to do it right. And that's where early on, because my supervisor was working in the area, I started asking questions. And the more questions I asked, the more I realized, gee, we're really not making the best of this method. We can do a lot better. And those questions kept me entertained for 20 years. Really, I believe that probably 20 years ago, market segmentation was very much of a process where people just did the same analysis, no matter what data, no matter what the research question. And some of these analyses were straight out dangerous. For example, one thing that's heavily used is called factor cluster segmentation. What happens here is we collect a lot of information from our tourists, and then we say, oh, gee, we've got too many questions. So why don't we first factor analyze and reduce the number of variables, so then when we do the grouping of consumers, we don't have too many. Yeah? Now you can intuitively see that if I collected, let's say, 30 pieces of information, and I break it down and compress it into 5 pieces of information, I've got to be losing information, right? And in fact, the percent variance explained, which explains how much we lose in a typical, how much we retain, I should say, in a typical business case is about 60 or 70%. So what does that mean? Well, sometimes it could be 50. So if it's 50, we are retaining 50% of the original information and discarding 50% before we do what we actually want to do, all right? So, and a lot of this was done, why? Because we are not methods experts, right? So people didn't do it the way they did it because they thought it was flawed, but it was the best at the time. It was the best of our knowledge. So over the last 20 years, we've queried a lot of those, let's call them habits, of market segmentation research, and have come up, I believe, with constructive ways forward. So an example for that is, for most statistical analyses, you can look at the statistics textbook and you will get information about what sample size you need. So if you want to calculate how many people do you need in your data set to be able to run that calculation. Well, for market segmentation analysis, there's no such rule. Yeah? And that's very dangerous, because imagine we use our 30 pieces of information. If we only have 30 respondents, is that going to be enough? Probably not. What about 60? What about 300? It was an unanswered question. So we ran quite extensive simulation studies to find out what would be a reasonable recommendation for a sample size. And we needed simulation studies because for real-world data, we never know what the truth is. But when we simulate data, we create exactly, we know what we've created. We understand the world we've created. So if we've planted 3 market segments in there, we know that the method needs to find 3 to do the right thing. And so we came up with a rule of about 100 respondents per piece of information, per variable. Because we've learned that at the beginning, there's a real big improvement. So beginning sample size doubling at low levels, really big improvement, but then it declines, right? So endless increase of sample size does nothing for you. So about 100 per variable used is a reasonable number. So that's just one of the little tangible things. Another one, which maybe I would point out as the most important in my view, is something we refer to as data structure analysis. So why are we doing this? in the past, when we ran market segmentation analyses, we assumed that market segments exist, right? We assumed that in the consumer data, there's little dumplings in space, and there are consumers. And we assumed that the algorithm's job is to identify these naturally existing groupings. Well, after a few years of segmenting empirical data, it became clear that very, very rarely do dumplings exist in space, right? So we figured out that if we want to end up with a valid result, we need to tell the user of the segmentation study what's actually the situation they find themselves in. So they can find themselves in one of three situations. There are real market segments in the data. If that's the case, and I can tell you that happens very rarely, but if it is the case, it does not matter which algorithm you use. You could use a lawnmower and it would find the three segments. Yeah? So this is a very, very simple situation for every algorithm. The worst case scenario is that there is no structure in the data. It's entirely scattered. Consumers have all variety of preferences. We cannot find any structure. Well, if that's the case, you would ask, should I be segmenting markets? And the answer is you should. Because even if it's totally scattered, these people are very, very different from these people. So you'd still want to offer them different things, right? But what we need to do in that case is we need to acknowledge that we are not trying to find something that's naturally existing, but that we are actually imposing on the data a structure that is managerially useful. Yeah? Now that makes it a lot more complicated. That means as a data analyst, I have to produce 10, 20, 100 solutions. And I need to work with the manager. Yeah? No statistical technique will give me the right answer because there's a million possible answers in this space. Yeah? So I need to work really closely with the manager to find not the true solution, but the managerially most useful solution. And then we had the third case. The third case is our case in the middle. And that happens quite a lot, we find. That's when the data set does not have cluster structure, but it has some other kind of structure. Yeah? And we can leverage this kind of structure to at least get similar solutions if we calculate again and again and again. Yeah? That's not the optimal case, but it's not the worst case. So what we can do then is we can find a relatively stable solution which we can recommend to management. And the trick is obviously to do things right is to do a lot of exploring of the data before we do the final grouping. So we first learn which case are we in, and once we know which case we are in, we can do the correct analysis to be able to go to the manager and say, all right, you are in this situation, here are possible solutions. Well, in this case, we say, here's your solution, that's it. Here we say, well, there's a few stable solutions, what do you think? Here we say, you know, we picked 10 out of a million, and what do you think about them? So very different approach. And overall, I think just showing how important conceptual aspects are, right? It's not like addition market segmentation analysis. 2 and 2 is always 4. Market segmentation analysis is by nature exploratory. So the data analyst and the manager need to work together and need to answer a large number of questions throughout the process of analysis. And the answer to each of those questions will actually determine quite substantially the solution. To give you one example of the impact, whether I have a data set and I chop it in 4 segments or in 10 is a big decision, right? Because the result will be totally different. Well, there's really no statistical technique that will tell you how many segments. So this single one decision is going to massively determine the outcome. And so like this decision, there's at least 10 decisions we need to make very carefully. We can't just take data, throw it into some stats program, and then worship the outcome, right? Because we are at risk of making big mistakes.